Good afternoon, Craig. How are you?
Good afternoon, Bassam. I'm fine.
Great to have you with us. I've been trying to reach you and have you on for many, many months to talk about a great many things. But today we are going to do a quick segment on what have we learned. We have five segments or five topics: Zionism, international law, responsibility for the genocide, Western values, and the media. Let me just start by asking you, how do you see the current moment? What are your views on the moment we are witnessing right now?
Well, in general terms, it's an historic moment, that's for sure, mostly for bad reasons. I think we are witnessing, of course, the first live streamed genocide in history. And we are witnessing at the same time the failed response of international institutions, of governments of the region, of governments of the world, of the collective West, to be sure. Uh, and um, and it's terrifying. It's terrifying to see that we are at a moment in history where there are no limits on the conduct of powerful states, even up to and including the commission of genocide. That should frighten everybody on the planet. I'm also feeling some hope, and I think I'm feeling hope because I have seen the mobilization of decent people all around the world who have been standing up to oppose this genocide, to oppose the apartheid that Israel imposes in Palestine, and to demand accountability for these crimes. That's new. The centerpiece of Israeli history for 76 years has been impunity, impunity that has been set up and defended by the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, other Western countries for all of these decades. And we are, for the first time, beginning to see some tears in that wall of impunity. That's encouraging. It's encouraging to see people standing up in official positions, but especially people in the streets and on universities and in capitals around the world, Jews and Christians and Muslims and agnostics and others, all coming together to say, no, not in our name. This has to stop. And that's a powerful thing. My own sense is that the Palestinian people were largely abandoned, at least for the 30 plus years of the so called Oslo process, and that the world is now belatedly beginning to wake up. But the cost has been horrendous. The cost in destruction and bloodshed has been horrendous. But we need to seize the opportunity, I think, to try to move forward in a better direction because all the forces of power outside of the power of people themselves are lined up against us. And this really does require a global movement at this moment, I think.
Craig, I would like to ask you five questions as we had discussed, and I would like to start with the word, concept, ideology of Zionism. You have 5 minutes or so, and we are all ears.
Okay, 5 minutes to cover 100 plus years of this political ideology. Well, it's funny that conversations around the issue of Zionism have been so constrained for so many years, and I think we all know why that is. You're talking about basically a kind of heretical product of fundamentalist Christian cults in the UK and the US long before Jewish European colonialists like Herzl picked up the idea of Zionism, and it's something that's always been hotly debated. It's only in recent years that censorship in countries across the West, in particular, has gotten so strong as to try to silence even a discussion about Zionism. It's not a mystery. Modern political Zionism is just European settler colonialism. It's not a concept that was invented by Herzl or even by Christian Zionists who came before him. And it's a particular model of European settler colonialism, which is a kind of subgenre of white supremacy that's known as Jewish supremacy. It is very zealously defended by the West as their last remaining colony. And it's the only political ideology you're not allowed to criticize. You can criticize democracy and capitalism and communism and socialism and anarchism, and there's any other political ideology in the world you are allowed to criticize in Western countries. The only one where you can be punished for criticizing a political ideology is Zionism. And I think the outlawing of criticism of political Zionism in the West that's happening now is proof of their fear that they are unable to defend this ideology on moral grounds. Because the minute you begin to unpack it, you see good old fashioned, bad old fashioned white supremacist settler colonialism. And I think the other thing that we've learned about this particular political ideology is that it's not only destructive in Palestine, and it's not only destructive in the broader Middle Eastern region, but it's proven to be highly destructive of institutions and norms in the West. It has corrupted governments, it has corrupted media corporations that have had to swear allegiance to this particular political ideology. It has created a new McCarthyism that stretches beyond the United States into other countries of the West. And even the sacred cow in the US of so called free speech or the First Amendment is being willingly slaughtered in defense of Zionism now in the US. So you can see the danger of this kind of political ideology, not just to the frontline victims who are being colonized in Palestine, but in some sense to all of us. But I think as an international human rights lawyer, what I can probably say with absolute certainty is that this is a political ideology that is fundamentally inconsistent with the norms and standards of international human rights law, right? I mean, these norms reject colonialism, apartheid, racial hierarchies, systematic discrimination, inequality. You know, this is the opposite of what the international human rights framework is supposed to represent. And it's not surprising. I mean, any settler colonialism practiced on Earth is by definition racist. If you want to establish a settler colony on the moon, maybe that would be an exception. But whenever you have to arrive at a place and you have to displace, erase, and replace the indigenous people, that is by definition a racist enterprise, a racist project. So it's not surprising that the UN actually adopted a resolution in 1975 saying that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination, and that held for years until it was ultimately revoked in 1991 as a condition that Israel put forward for its participation in the Oslo process. But I think that when people look at this particular political ideology, they will very quickly understand why that resolution was passed in 1975. And I think we're moving back in the direction of recognizing this moral reality, because the International Court of Justice, they have ended this detour around Oslo that said that international law doesn't apply, human rights don't apply. We all have to negotiate for what rights are going to be tossed to the Palestinian people. And that has opened up a lot of doors. And we're already seeing now in the follow-up resolution in the General Assembly of the UN that they're talking about new anti-apartheid mechanisms that are on the way. There's a movement around the UN to reestablish the anti-apartheid mechanisms to confront Israeli apartheid. And I think that is encouraging. I think that they have overplayed their censorship hand and that the genie is out of the bottle now and it's not going back in.
Well, a good segue is into international law. In the past year, we've seen international law being trampled upon so many times, and it's really disheartening. Not because we had hopes that international law will actually bring about emancipation, but because we thought that its negation will have some limits. What have we learned in the past year regarding international law?
Yeah. Bassam, I've written and spoken on this point quite a bit. And I always start with telling people to go back to 1948, which was the year that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted. It was the year that the Genocide Convention was adopted, but it was also the year that the Nakba took place in Palestine and the year that apartheid was established in South Africa. So you can see that what the international community was doing was, on the one hand, they were establishing these rules of conduct, these rules to protect human dignity that applied to everybody, but at the same time, they were carving out exceptions for some people, especially the Palestinians and the colonized South Africans. And while the international community remained very focused, beginning in the 1970s straight through the 1980s, on trying to bring down apartheid and to liberate the South African people, the international community abandoned the Palestinian people when Oslo was adopted. And they pushed all of this aside, an opportunity to correct the wrongs of the past that were perpetrated, and in which, by the way, the UN, for which the UN holds significant responsibility, it participated in the original sin of the displacement and replacement of the Palestinian people. But with the entry in the 1960s and 1970s of so many newly independent, formerly colonized countries, you saw this increase in attention to international law, to human rights in Palestine, right up until the time of the adoption of the resolution on Zionism as racism that we just discussed. But then the brakes were put on it very firmly by this ruse of Oslo, and so this idea of exceptionalism, of carving out an exception for Israel, which permeates virtually everything as we're seeing. This goes at least back to the founding of the State of Israel, indeed even beforehand, with all of the shenanigans of the British and other colonial powers at the time. But now I think what's happening is people are beginning to see that the age of exceptionalism has to come to an end because it leads to genocide. I think the West was very comfortable when the pace of genocide over the course of 76 years was incremental in Palestine. But with the new government that arrived in Israel last year, opting for expedited genocide, it made some in the West uncomfortable, but not enough to stop the flow of arms and diplomatic cover and support for the genocide as it has been occurring. And people have seen that with their own eyes. So I think that in this period, Israel is literally on trial. They're on trial for genocide in the International Court of Justice. There are requests for arrest warrants for their prime minister and their defense minister. Others are expected to follow. There are mounds of evidence collected by the United Nations, by human rights organizations, and others. So Israel is very much on trial. But international law and international institutions are also on trial. And if they fail, and they have failed miserably so far, but I think we can talk about the positive side. But if they fail in holding Israel to account, even for war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and genocide, then the legitimacy of those institutions will not survive. I'm absolutely certain of that. They will simply fade away. And the people working in those institutions know it. There are some who would very much like to defer to the pressure that they get from the US and the UK and the Israel lobby and others, but they know they cannot because they know their institutions are at stake and their own reputations are at stake as well. When the whole world is watching the genocide on their screens, they know it's happening and they know these institutions are accountable. I think this is true of all of the international institutions. The Security Council has proven itself to be wholly unable to address genocide. It really is something that belongs in a Cold War museum, as I've said in the past. It can deal with conflicts in the traditional sense, and a subset of those conflicts, only those that the P5 wanted to address, but everything else is just left to burn. And that shows how utterly incapable an institution like the Security Council is to rise to the moment. It can be paralyzed again and again by a US veto, even for something as simple as a ceasefire. So it's proven itself to be, they're now talking about reform of the Security Council at the United Nations. The proposals on the table, the discussions where they're not reform. They're, as the old saying goes, rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. I don't see how the Council comes out of this with any legitimacy whatsoever. And then you have United Nations mechanisms, like there's actually, you wouldn't know it, but there's actually an Office on the Prevention of Genocide, which has been essentially silent throughout the entire genocide because it's under control of a Secretary General who did not want to irritate the Americans or the Israelis or their partners. And then you ask, why does that office exist? It has lost all legitimacy, and I don't think in its current form it will survive. On the positive side, we have seen the International Court of Justice step up with the genocide case, but also with the opinion that it released on the illegality of the occupation, extremely important. So it will live to fight another day. We've seen a lot of inaction, some trepidatious responses by others within the UN and elsewhere, undercutting their survivability, I think. And then we've also seen that there is direct corruption of these courts and mechanisms that comes, not just with diplomatic démarches, but with actual threats and inducements brought by Israel, its Western sponsors, their intelligence, agencies. And so, if that pressure wins the day, that's the end for those institutions. But it's also, I think, a moment of international law where we've seen historic vindication of the Palestinian cause, especially in the International Court of Justice, as I say, on issues like the occupation as entirely unlawful, the fact that Israel practices racial segregation and apartheid, support in that most recent finding of the court for BDS, for boycott, divestment, sanctions, indeed calling on states to cut off economic, diplomatic, military, and other ties with Israel's occupation in the Palestinian territories. So there is some vindication, there's some hope that these institutions will step up and survive. But I've been saying for a year now, since my letter went to the United Nations, that this is an obvious textbook case of genocide. We knew it in October. We've known it all throughout. If these institutions are unwilling or unable to respond to something so blatant as a live streamed genocide, then they will not survive, and I think they do not deserve to survive. Yeah,
Craig, you have resigned your office at the UN, correct?
that's right.
And can you take a minute just to tell us why in relation
Well,
to
this
international law and the UN?
yeah, this was 2023. The letter is all over on the internet. People can read the letter that I wrote, setting out my concerns about the unfolding genocide in Palestine, about responsibility of the UN, in part for what's happening there, about its weak response to that as it was emerging by its efforts to silence some as well, and where I sort of set out what I thought was a better course, which is basically just to say, let's do in Palestine what we do everywhere else. We insist on international law. We insist on equality. We insist on human rights. We insist on the right to return. We insist on compensation. We insist on protection for those who are vulnerable. We insist on accountability for perpetrators. In other words, address the root causes. If you really want to stop these cycles of violence that participate, it's about liberating the Palestinian people. And that the UN has a history of being able to do that. It did it with regard to apartheid in South Africa until apartheid fell. But as I said earlier, in the case of Palestine, it surrendered to Oslo, which became a smokescreen behind which you saw continued persecution, dispossession, settlement, expulsion, gross violations of human rights, violations of the laws of war, and even genocide happening behind that smokescreen of Oslo. And I was asking the UN to return to its core, fundamental normative mission of protecting the human rights of the Palestinian people, including the right to self-determination. I mean, for me, last year, this actually started very early in the year, in the springtime, when there were a series of attacks on Palestinian communities in Jerusalem and in the West Bank, including settler pogroms that were purging Palestinian villages without any, I think, meaningful response on the part of the international community. And I said then in the spring that this was unacceptable. There was an effort within the UN to silence my public speaking about what was happening in Palestine at that time, and that was something that I couldn't countenance. And then, of course, things just got progressively worse leading up to and beyond October, with full-blown genocide being perpetrated. So my last act was to write that letter about the UN's failings in Palestine and the course that we needed to take in order to be true to our mandates. And then left in the end of October last year, and I've just been working on my own pretty much full time on the genocide in Palestine since then.
We will have a link connected to the program when it's published, and people can see the letter unless you tell me otherwise. The
Absolutely.
next topic is the question of responsibility for the genocide. This is something that we are engaging with because there is more than Israel that is culpable here in terms of states and so on. What have we learned about the question of responsibility for this genocide that's taking place?
Well, I mean, I've already spoken about the responsibility of the so-called international community, of international institutions and UN bodies and others, for not doing everything that can be done to prevent and then to respond to and punish the genocide, beginning by talking about it, uttering the word. There's a rhetorical device in the UN and other international institutions that they like to use to avoid having to pronounce, where they say only a court can decide on genocide. Well, that may be true, like any other crime of torture, war crimes, and others. In the end, only a court can decide on them. But if you wait to pronounce on genocide in such an obvious case as this, until some court has banged the gavel on the case, it's too late, and you have already failed in your legal obligation of prevention. Prevention happens before the genocide is complete, and you can't get away from that by saying, "Well, it's only a court can decide." And I'm afraid that's what's been happening at the international level. Of course, principal responsibility for this and all other crimes lies with the perpetrator. The perpetrator here is the government of Israel, its military forces, its political leadership. They are committing crimes under the Genocide Convention for which they can be held accountable. And I hope they will, some of them, be held accountable for the crimes that they are perpetrating. There's also the Genocide Convention talks about holding not just officials accountable, but private persons and private actors accountable as well. And there have been plenty in Israeli society, in the media, and in general, who have been involved in incitement to genocide, complicity in genocide, and so on. They too are responsible for this crime. So the political and military establishment, media figures there, as well as dual nationals, by the way, who are in many Western countries and who shuttle back and forth to participate in the killing. But there's another crime in the Genocide Convention, which is complicity, which is a separate crime. And here I have said that the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and some other Western countries in particular have committed the crime of complicity because, in previous genocides, like the Rwanda genocide, the crime that they committed was they just backed off. They didn't do anything to stop it, right? So we've seen cables that were sent out, diplomatic cables at the time, the Americans and the Brits, in particular, instructing their diplomatic staff not to use the word genocide during the Rwanda genocide because they knew that that would oblige them legally to do something to intervene to stop the genocide. So their sin there was not to do anything to stop it. Their sin in the genocide in Palestine is actually a much worse one because here they are actively participating in the genocide, actively complicit in the genocide by providing arms and weapons and intelligence support, diplomatic cover right up to the use of the veto, and even using their podiums, their official podiums, to disseminate Israeli disinformation, propaganda, justifications for war crimes. So that's a crime of complicity, and individuals within the U.S. government can and should, and I hope some, will be held accountable for their complicity. The same is true in the UK and Germany, other countries that have been so directly involved. They know exactly what's happening on the ground, and they continue to provide the necessary diplomatic, military, economic, and other support that is necessary for it to continue. It could not continue without the United States allowing it and supporting it to continue. So that is the crime of complicity. I also think there needs to be a reckoning with regard to Western media corporations. There is a history, there are precedents going all the way back to the end of World War II, with the Nuremberg Tribunal prosecuting figures like Julius Streicher of Der Stürmer and finding him guilty of incitement and complicity in genocide against European Jews. More recently, we had the cases of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda holding media personalities accountable for their participation in the Rwanda genocide. And I think we're seeing a lot of the same patterns now. So there are people in the media, I think, that have to be held accountable for this, for complicity, and the law recognizes that as well. And I think in the end, one of the most horrifying things that we have witnessed, people always talked about, well, what do you suppose you would do if you were alive during the Holocaust, for example? And, I'm always telling people, well, you don't have to wonder anymore, because the same kinds of crimes are being perpetrated against the Palestinian people. And there are far too many people who go about their daily business And fine, if you are in Botswana and your government is not playing any role in this, okay, maybe you don't get involved. But if you're living in one of the countries that are complicit in the genocide, and you're not standing up and speaking up, worse if you're trying to silence those who are, I don't know that one could bring a legal case against you, but I'm absolutely certain that history will not treat them kindly. Those who have been silent in the face of this genocide, who could have spoken up, could have brought pressure on the other side in order to stop it, because this kind of a massive, massive crime cannot continue unless it's allowed to continue, unless it's supported in its continuation by the countries in the West. And I think we all are accountable in that respect.
I'd like to move on to the pretense of, in quote, Western values, something that we have actually been hearing for decades. And the actual deployment of this term or phrase is meant to establish a distinction, the idea that we are X and we believe in X and so on and so forth. So, what have we learned about the pretense of, in quotation marks, Western values?
Well, obviously, the curtain has been pulled back on those arrogant assertions of some, basic good that exists in the West and doesn't exist in other places. I think one of the most important developments globally of this year of genocide has been that the West has been revealed for what it, in fact, really is. I mean, every society is heterogeneous, right? Not everybody has the same values. But if we're talking about the dominant values of Western governments, Western elites, Western corporations, the Western media, I said, you have to admit that settler colonialism, white supremacy, militarism, these are Western values. These are very, not that they don't exist in other places, but they are very clearly Western values, as is the idea of exceptionalism. I mean, that's a hallmark of Western history. On the one hand, you pronounce these ideals, and on the other hand, you violate them with impunity every opportunity that you have. That the benefits of human rights are for us, and the violation of human rights are for others. Israel has been held out as a Western exception that is not accountable to the Genocide Convention, to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to the international human rights treaties, to common decency, even. And so that reveals the hypocrisy of the assertion of so-called Western values. I think you could also say that Orientalism has been a constant Western value for centuries, beginning in Europe and then spreading into the US, newer countries as well. And we're seeing Orientalism in spades these days in the way that reporting and discussions around what's happening in the Middle East occur. I think it is absolutely undeniable that racism and Islamophobia have been central to Western values throughout all of their history. So I don't think we should be surprised that Israel, as a Western outpost, created by the West out of blood-soaked whole cloth, we shouldn't be surprised that it's built on an extreme form of these negative values of the West: militarism and racism and Islamophobia and exceptionalism, right? I mean, whole states have been built around the idea of exceptionalism. The U.S. is one, Israel is another one. This is part of their founding myths, right? So these are the very negative, I think, values. And I think, you have to observe that discussions about values in the West are always tainted by a very large dose of hypocrisy. Human rights, democracy, the rule of law, these are all asserted by the West as a part of their values, but they've never been respected by the West vis-a-vis whoever is deemed to be the other, right? These are rights for us, but the other, no. I mean, you can ask the genocided indigenous people of the Americas, or the enslaved Africans in the US, or the victims of Jim Crow in the US, or even people living in poverty today in countries like the US. Or, ask all those people around the world who were massacred by the bombs and the bullets of Western armies, in China, in the Philippines, in Vietnam, in Western co-opted Middle Eastern states that have to put up with the Western-sponsored repression, and across Africa, Latin America, I mean, you name it. Or even ask the people who are trapped in the prison of poverty now by Western imperial exploitation, the imposition of these destructive neoliberal economics that are imposed on them by the West. Ask any of them whether human rights, democracy, and the rule of law are Western values, and I'm sure they will laugh in your face. I mean, the world is not fooled by this kind of rhetoric. And certainly after the genocide of 23 to 24, no Western power is going to be able to say those things with a straight face again, or at least be respected when they do. Now, I want to say also, Bassam, there's another West, and that's the people in civil society and social movements and labor unions on university campuses, all of whom are now and who have always stood up to oppose these negative values of the West, the wars of the West, the human rights violations of the West. And, I have to say, it's a pretty arrogant claim, if you think about it, for someone in the West to pretend that human rights are Western values. The West did not invent human rights, and they do not have a proud record of respecting them, least of all vis-a-vis all of the crimes that I've just mentioned of the West. But these other people in the West, those that are standing up to protest the genocide and apartheid in Palestine, Jews, Christians, Muslims, agnostics, everybody, who are facing harassment and assault and smears and being called awful names and being slandered and fired and suspended, being beaten and arrested by the police. I mean, they are a light in the West. Those are the values that we have to embrace. But if you ask them, and they're products of the West, they're the people of the West as well. But if you ask them whether they represent Western values, they will never say that they do. They'll be talking about universal values, right? The values of humanity. And they're just insisting that these values have to be applied universally. So Western values, I don't think it's anything to brag about, given what those values have looked like over the course of recent centuries and how they're exposed today during the genocide in Palestine. But there are people in the West who have decent values, universal values of things like human rights and equality, and who are standing up at personal risk to defend them. And I think that's good news.
Craig, I want to ask you a separate question that has nothing to do with anything we're talking about, and that is, why are you leaving out the atheists when you are talking about, categories? You said agnostics twice.
Did I? I don't know. I'm just used to saying agnostics from all of my conversations, but yeah, atheists and Buddhists and Hindus and animists. That's. I mean, that really is the beauty of it. When you look at the face of those in Western society or standing up to protest these horrors, it is a face of many faiths, races, religions, ethnicities, social status. It's people. It's people. It's not these Western institutions that are so deeply, deeply corrupted by the negative values of militarism and Zionism and colonialism and imperialism and so on. So yeah, we want to include the atheists there as well. Absolutely.
لو سمحت, if you will. All right. Let's move to the last question and topic. Although you addressed the complicity of the media, which is, I'm assuming, going to be part of how you'll address what we have learned in the past year about the media, the role of the media. And we're talking here about mainstream media, although feel free to define it as you wish.
Yeah, I think my critique has been of the corporate media, as we say in the West, and also the BBC, which technically is not corporate media, but has the same kind of framing. And I've been saying that, there are three pillars to the genocide that's happening in Palestine. One is the ruthlessness of the Israeli genocide machine. The other is the direct complicity of the US, the UK, and others, without which this could not be carried on. But there's a third pillar, and that is the role of complicit Western media who have knowingly disseminated Israeli disinformation and propaganda, who have used their broadcast to justify war crimes and crimes against humanity, who have consistently dehumanized Palestinians, including Palestinian victims, and who have been blacking out information on the genocide in the West. If you are getting all your news from the West, you may well not know what the real story is. And I have said that, under international law, some of these actions by these media companies can be subject to sanctions. There are historical precedents going all the way back, as I said, to the Nuremberg tribunals, and then again in the Rwanda tribunals. And international standards, international law provides the possibility for them to be held accountable, and they have been. They have been arrested and convicted for their engagement in activities that contributed to the genocide. And remember that the Genocide Convention not only outlaws genocide and complicity, but it also outlaws incitement to genocide. And the drafters of that convention knew very well what happened at Nuremberg with the conviction of Julius Streicher for his work under Sturmer during the extermination of European Jews. So I've been saying there has to be some kind of accountability. Some of that accountability may be criminal accountability. Some of that accountability may be in civil courts, and some of it may be economic and other kinds of accountability. If you look at the mental state of these Western media companies, this is the first, as I said, the first live stream genocide in history. It's unfolding on everybody's screens. It is not credible to suggest that Western media companies are not aware of what the realities are on the ground and of what they're doing to obscure them. And in criminal law, we talk about the mens rea, right? We talk about the mental state. And in this case, they are doing this knowingly. They know what's happening, and yet they are broadcasting this material to distort what's happening on the ground and providing propaganda for it to continue. They are making conscious choices to hide the genocide, to dehumanize Palestinian victims, and to protect Israeli perpetrators from accountability. So to me, that makes them complicit, and some of that would rise to the level of incitement. And the audience, right? So if you want to see what is the direct nexus, I mean, you say, so what if CNN and Fox News and BBC are broadcasting all of this complicit kind of broadcasting and blacking out the real information and so on? It's just them doing their thing, free speech, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not really true because their audiences, the people that they're broadcasting to, are not disinterested, uninvolved bystanders, right? It includes, and this is for print media as well, like the New York Times and the Washington Post that have been guilty in this regard. Their audience includes Western government officials and policymakers who are directly complicit in the genocide. Their audience includes the people who are providing the military, economic, intelligence, and diplomatic support to the genocide. And their audience includes the voting public that enables that support. And their audience also includes a lot of dual Israeli nationals who shuttle back and forth from the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and actually participate in the killing. So the charge of incitement is not that far-fetched, and the nexus between the media incitement on the one side and the actual harmful actions on the ground is much more direct than these companies would want to admit. So I think there has to be some kind of accountability. I wrote on this that if you were only watching Western media or reading Western corporate media, you would probably have no idea that Israel is on trial now at the World Court for genocide, or that there are arrest warrants requests for its leaders for crimes against humanity. You will have never heard the statements of genocidal intent by the president, the prime minister, cabinet ministers, military commanders. You will probably still believe the false stories of beheaded Israeli babies, which we know were fabricated, but you will also be unaware that real Palestinian babies have in fact been beheaded. You won't know about the systematic killing of civilians, children, babies, older persons. You won't be aware of the torture camps or systematic rape of Palestinian detainees, or Israeli snipers targeting small children. You won't know that Israel is the world record holder now for the murder of journalists, of aid workers, of UN officials, of healthcare workers. They've got the world record for all of those. So yeah, the damage is real. The harm is real. The nexus between what these media companies are doing on the one hand and the suffering on the other is real. We know what they're doing to cover it up. We know how they are blocking voices of Palestinians and human rights defenders, how they're actually smearing and slandering human rights defenders, how they're using language to avoid Israeli culpability, even not to irritate the Israelis by not even mentioning occupied territories or Palestine or refugee camps, claiming in media reports that everybody is collateral damage if they're killed, or they were human shields, or maybe they were terrorists at worst, right? So distorting international law, distorting the facts on the ground, all to buttress the case for Israeli impunity, it seems to me, is something that demands accountability. So yeah, I think that not all of these will be, there are tribunals, there are commissions of inquiry that are already looking into these things. There are courts that are already looking into these things. You may see a specialized tribunal established, but one way or another, criminal accountability for those who engaged in direct incitement or complicity in genocide amongst media companies, that has to come. And even where it doesn't, one can imagine national courts taking up some cases where people have suffered harm, either criminal cases or in torts, right? For civil cases to compensate those who have suffered harms as a result of this. And at the very least, the court of public opinion has to hold these media companies accountable. They're already suffering economically. They'll suffer more if everybody will just turn that off, stop your subscriptions, switch your attention to independent media away from these corporations that are distorting reality and causing massive harms around the world, and then let them pay for it. In the end, I've said the task of ensuring accountability for these media companies falls on all of us. But Bassam, I just want to say one more thing on this. I never want to talk about this topic without saying that the last thing we want to do is to erode free speech protections in any way, because those protections are more important for us than they are for them. They never go after for free speech those who are in power, those who have the support of the U.S. Congress and U.S. corporations and the U.S. administration. They'll always go after, if those free speech guarantees are reduced, it's us they'll go after, the people who are challenging power, who are challenging the U.S. government, who are challenging Israel and the Israeli lobby. So we want to make sure that we address this problem in a way that preserves free speech guarantees. But incitement to genocide and complicity in genocide are crimes. And there are exceptions to free speech that relate to things like libel and slander, where accountability can be had. So we need to protect our rights and jealously defend them, at the same time that we need to ensure accountability for these corporations for the harms that they have caused on the ground.
I cannot help but say, and I'll say it quickly because we're running out of time, that we've seen this before in the lead up to the Iraq war. We've seen the media play one of the most cynical roles in modern US history in creating a narrative that is completely manufactured regarding why attacking Iraq, which is something that the White House was planning or talking about, and was instead of being checked by the media reinforced the narrative. And of course, years after, they took it back. CNN, New York Times have actually literally announced, for instance, that we were not scrutinizing, these stories and narratives enough. And of course, they have gotten away with it. So the WMDs, the question of links to Al Qaeda with the leadership in Iraq, they are the beheaded babies story today. And they completely recovered simply because they actually said we're sorry. And I fear that this might be the case, although there's something tells me that we're 20 some years ahead of that, and that might actually have created a bit more cynicism in a positive way among the public. And I hope that this will not be repeated in terms of having the media get away with murder again. Our last segment is actually a question, a parting question that you don't have to respond to if you feel that you're satisfied with what you have shared. But it is basically, where might we be headed on all the fronts that we have discussed, or any other front that you'd like to leave our audience with?
Well, I think we're in the immediate term, we're headed for more horror. We're headed for the obvious product of impunity, which is more violence. We're already seeing Israel expanding its murder campaign into Lebanon, even as it continues its horrific violence against Palestinians in Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. So I think in the immediate term, the failure of international institutions and the complicity of Western governments have set up a very horrific near future for all of us, but most especially for those under Israeli bombs and bullets. I think in the medium term, the movement is growing globally for Palestinian freedom, for an end to apartheid, for accountability for the genocide. And I think that movement is going to prevail. I think we're looking at a pivotal moment in history where we see, on the one hand, the erosion, not very gradual, but the quick erosion of American imperial power, of the unipolar moment that the US has enjoyed. And part of that is going to be an end, it seems to me, in its current form, of the colonial project in the Middle East, that is Israel, that is political Zionism. And where that will bring us in the long term remains to be seen. I think personally that the idea of a two-state solution is gone. I think it's a mantra which is repeated by people in the West in particular as a distraction away from human rights, away from equality, away from root causes, away from dealing with the realities on the ground. You can just say, well, we're committed to a two-state solution. The Americans do it all the time. It's an absurdity because they do everything they can to block a two-state solution. It happens with UN officials and others. But the reality is that there's nothing left for a two-state solution other than potentially some Bantustans, which would not satisfy the Palestinian right to self-determination. That the two-state solution proposal never answered the question of the rights of the Palestinians inside the Green Line, inside what is today Israel, their right to return, their right to equality, their right not to live in an apartheid or ethnic hierarchy inside of the Green Line, that the only meaningful end to all of this is equal rights for Christians, Muslims, Jews, atheists, and others. A constitution based upon the rule of law, the right of all Palestinians to return to their homes, compensation, the same values, universal values that we insist on everywhere else have to be insisted on also in Palestine, unless we are admitting that the Palestinians are children of a lesser God. So I think that in the long term is where there is hope. There's a growing movement for it. But in the meantime, the movement itself for an end to apartheid, for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, this is the most important piece of the puzzle, alongside Palestinian steadfastness and Palestinian resistance, is global solidarity to weaken the support that Israel gets from the US, the UK, Germany, and these other complicit countries, to insist upon and use international law whenever we can, knowing that international law itself has never liberated anybody, but that's an important tool in our toolkit as well. Using social movements, using boycotts and divestment and sanction and so on, getting those apartheid mechanisms reestablished that brought so much pressure to bear on South Africa, to now have those kinds of pressures redirected toward liberation of the Palestinian people, and to work toward accountability for perpetrators and redress for victims. I mean, the menu is out there. A protection force for the Palestinians, for example, in the immediate term, legal accountability for the perpetrators, redress, compensation, rebuilding, all of those sorts of things. That's all a part of the project going forward. But I am very glad that in spite of very brutal tactics on the part of Western governments, they have not succeeded in suppressing the resistance to the horrors in which they are complicit in Palestine. And I don't think this movement is going away. It's going to grow stronger. And as I said when we began here, the curtain has been pulled back on Western hypocrisy and Western values. And we see now the reality of what this project is all about. People who never thought about Palestine before are now horrified and are now enlisted to the cause. And they're not going anywhere. Younger generations are with us. Progressive Jews are with us. Righteous Muslims and Christians and others, labor unions, so many people who are standing up to say that this is the great injustice of our age, of our era, and that it has to end. And it will end. It will end. In the long term, we will see justice. In the medium term, there will be struggle. In the immediate term, there is horror that will continue until Israel is reined in one way or another. But I am hopeful that the trajectory is bending in the right direction.
Craig, this was exceptionally concise and insightful, and you did not create any situations where we would have to sort of edit anything or adjust anything. So thank you for that. And for the other thing, I am really happy that we were able to speak. I've been chasing you for months. And finally, we got you to come and share with our audience your thoughts. And it was so much worth it. So thank you so much. And I hope that we could continue speaking going forward. And I really look forward to reading, continuing to read what you write. So many of us follow you on social media, and if you happen to be writing a book right now or something of the sort, you're going to have a lot of readers.
Yeah, very good. Well, Bassam, let me thank you for the work that you've been doing. I've been following you online throughout. I've really appreciated the intelligent discussions that you've had with so many great guests and your own work on this, and very happy to be with you finally. I'm sorry it took us so long to get together, but invite me back. I'll be happy to return.
I'd love to. Shukran. Thank you, Craig, and have a wonderful evening or
Thank you,
afternoon.
Bassam. Thank you.